I'm Shauna Perry, and I'm the board president at the moment. And so glad to have everybody here, our speakers and all of our people on Zoom and here at the library. I want to acknowledge that we're sponsored by the East Bonner County Library and the Sandpoint Parks and Rec group. So thank you very much for all your support. As you know, we're trying new technology, so just bear with us because every day we have one of these, it's a new experience. So just let us know when, if you can't hear in the back, just please raise your hand or something. And Zoom, you're on your own. No. Let's see. So one of the things I wanted to do was to thank our treat people. And our treat people are Isabel Holregal. Is that right? Holregal. Yes. And Vicki Johnson. Raise your hand. Yeah. And Isabel is going to pass around a little form that you can sign if you're willing to bring some treats once in a while. So Isabel, did you start that already? Okay. Let's see. A couple other things, just some dates that will be coming up, like April 29th to May 2nd will be our City Nature Challenge. And you'll hear more information about all of these, but just putting dates in your head. May 7th is the Arbor Day. It's 150th year of Arbor Day. And the City of Sandpoint and KNPS and a bunch of other groups are going to be doing something at the Lakeview Park on May 7th. And then June 4th is our plant sale. So just keep those in mind. What else? If you're interested in joining, oh, I don't think I brought any membership. Oh, there are some membership forms on the table. Absolutely. Great. And then people can get on our website, which is nativeplantssociety.org. And that's it. Now I'm going to introduce Preston. Preston's our vice president and in charge of programs. He's been doing a great job. So there we go.
Thank you, Shauna. Thank you and welcome everyone from out there in Zoom and here in Sandpoint. I'm going to share my screen and just cover a couple slides here about. Can't hear me? Okay, I'll speak louder. Thank you. Okay. Good to know. Okay. Just first, I want to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Inland Salish peoples, including the Kalispel, Kootenai, and Coeur d'Alene nations, who continue to live here and care for these lands, its waters, and its native plants and animals. We offer our thanks to the Inland Salish peoples, their history and cultures, as well as their continuing care for these lands for the generations to come. The Kinnickinnic Native Plant Society, for those that don't know, who aren't members, was established in 1998. Let's see if I can move some of these. 1998 as a chapter of the Idaho Native Plant Society. Okay. My button there. Okay. Became the Kinnickinnic Native Plant Society in 2010. And our mission is to foster an understanding and appreciation of native flora and their habitats in the northern Idaho Panhandle through education, conservation, and the use of native plants in landscaping and restoration. We have an arboretum that was established and we care for the North Idaho Native Plant Arboretum at Lakeview Park in Sandpoint. If you get a chance to visit that at any season, it's beautiful. And we're always looking for volunteers to help us keep that in shape. We also published the book, Landscaping with Native Plants in the Idaho Panhandle, and it's available in bookstores from Bonners Ferry all the way down to Moscow. It's a really great resource. Our next month's program on April 16th here at the library will be, it's titled The Cultural History of Camas Use by the Kalispel Tribe, and that's going to be presented by Dr. Molly Carney from Washington State University. She's worked with the Kalispel tribe for quite a few years now, and that'll be a very interesting program. And then also that afternoon, we'll have iNaturalist training in preparation for City Nature Challenge, and that'll be sponsored by the Ponderay chapter of the Idaho Master Naturalists and KNPS. And finally, visit our website, as Shauna said, nativeplantssociety.org. We have a Facebook page, become a member, make a donation. We appreciate all those things. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce our speakers for today. And the title of this program is Palouse Prairie Restoration Project, the Palouse Prairie Restoration Project. It's going to be presented by Dr. Erik Budsberg, Kristy Snyder, and Seth McCullough from Eastern Washington University in Cheney. Let me give a little background about our speakers today. Dr. Budsberg is the Director of Sustainability. He has a PhD and a master's degree from the University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences and a Bachelor of Science in Geology from Western Washington University. His graduate research focused on the use of life cycle assessment methodology to evaluate the potential environmental impacts related to the commercial production of biofuels and biochemicals. At Eastern Washington University, Dr. Budsberg's work includes incorporating sustainable planning into campus operations, identifying pathways to carbon neutrality, managing the Prairie Restoration Project, and establishing Eastern Washington University as a leader in sustainability. A lot of work to do there. Very good work to do. Our other speakers will be Kristy Snyder. She's a Master's of Science student in biology, and Seth McCullough is a Bachelor of Science student in biology from Eastern Washington University. Kristy has worked in restoration at the California Botanic Garden, and she is now learning about Palouse Prairie restoration here in Northeast Washington. Seth is a McNair Scholar conducting research on soil health and microbial communities at the restoration site, and has worked as a freshwater invertebrate field technician and soil restoration ecology technician at Eastern Washington University. So with that introduction, please welcome our speakers, Erik, Kristy, and Seth.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for the introduction, Preston. It's great to be here, and yeah, nice to try this kind of hybrid version of some people in person and Zoom and figuring that all out as we go. So let me see if I can pull up the presentation here. All right, is everybody looking at the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, hopefully we can go to, all right, and we're in presentation view there. So all good to go?
Good.
Yeah. All right, well, yeah. As Preston mentioned, we're coming from Eastern Washington University. I'm the Director of Sustainability at Eastern, which means that a lot of things that touch environmental-based issues at the university end up kind of coming under my purview, with the Prairie Restoration Project being one of those. And so today we wanted to kind of give you an overview of what the Prairie Restoration Project means for Eastern, kind of how we'll be setting it up, and then also where we're at in that process. Kristy and Seth have been doing excellent work as they move through their academic careers, and a lot of their research and work has focused on working with the Prairie Restoration Project. So before I get started there, is the volume good on that? Do I need to speak louder, or we good?
Perfect.
All right.
That's great.
All right, cool. So just a little bit of a background. Y'all aren't too far away from Eastern, but just to give a kind of a rough sense of what Eastern looks like, we're a regional comprehensive state university. So that means when you look at Washington, like University of Washington, WSU, they're the big R1 research schools, and we kind of fall under that next tier where we really seek to serve the broader community in Washington with the goal of really pursuing a lot of great academic, undergraduate academic opportunities, as well as graduate opportunities within certain programs like biology, which has a master's program. We're located in Cheney, Washington. Cheney is a rural community. It's about 20 minutes from Spokane. So while I do live in Spokane and work out there, it's easy enough to get out there, but it certainly is more of a rural community out there. Our student population currently is just under 11,000 students. Our campus is about 300 plus acres, and the Prairie Restoration Project is about 120 acres, and that 120 acres is included in that 300 acres. So we're really talking about almost half of our campus that we're looking to convert back to native habitat, which for us is a Palouse grassland ecosystem. We currently don't have a large green space on campus. So if you go to other schools, some schools might have an arboretum or other natural space on campus. Eastern currently doesn't have that. And so this project is kind of our chance to be able to kind of bring that to Eastern and help kind of redefine what our campus looks like for students and visitors to campus. And so we're planning to restore farmland that we own. We've owned it since the mid-60s and have leased it out to local farmers to kind of help manage the land. And shouldn't be any surprise that for probably a lot of people that WSU does all the ag research in Washington, and we don't do any ag research at Eastern. But we do a lot of great work in biology, especially within restoration and ecology. And so this is our chance to really kind of jump more into what we really specialize in by going into more of a restoration project. So the goal of our project is to restore, I'm gonna move my screen here just a little bit so I can actually see things. There we go. Hold on real quick. All right, yeah, that's fine. So the goal of our project is to restore EW farmland to native habitat with a goal to preserve natural land on campus that will foster research and educational opportunities, increase biodiversity, and provide recreational space on multi-use trails. And so here's kind of an overview of what our campus looks like. You can see kind of hopefully the dotted red lines kind of going around there. That's the defined boundary of land that Eastern owns. So that's about that 300 acres. And the restoration project we're taking on here, you can see in the light blue, it's kind of this farmland on the western boundary of campus. For those who have been to campus or know us for our football program, you can see our field here, our red turf football field. So if you've been out to campus, we're talking to the west of that. If you park in the parking lot for football games or for other reasons, up in the free parking lots here, this is there. And our water tower is up here, just to kind of help orient to if people have kind of a general sense of what our campus looks like. So why are we taking this on? Well, for a number of reasons. But one of the main ones is when we talk about Palouse, it is technically considered a critically endangered ecosystem. Over 99% of the Palouse has been lost to agriculture and development over the past, let's say 200 plus years. And what remaining parcels are left, there's a few places where you can find intact Palouse on a larger scale, like hundreds of acres, but those are very few and far between. And mostly what's left is kind of like these little remnants on usually the north facing slopes where farmers just haven't been able to farm because the hill was just too steep or too rocky and just couldn't get farm equipment on there. And so there really isn't much left of the Palouse. And so by us restoring 120 acres, we're actually contributing to, it's not just we're doing a small part here and there's a lot of other large sections and we're part of that. We're actually part of the active conversation of how do we look at addressing this ecosystem that's essentially been lost over time. The Palouse is a really productive from a farmland standpoint, and kind of the work we're talking about here isn't to take away from the great work the farmers are doing, providing food and helping to do a lot of work in that standpoint. It's more of how do we look at ecosystem loss and managing farmland and looking at those trade-offs and what that means and maybe where it'd be appropriate to restore land that's lost versus where it's appropriate to keep it as farmland. And so we're starting to get into those initial conversations about what that looks like and kind of bigger discussions for the region as a whole. So when we talk about the restoration, big part for this too is looking at what it means for diverse habitats for us. A kind of a goal of this is to really increase the biodiversity on campus. The Palouse ecosystem as a whole is one that was characterized by grasses and forbs, and Kristy and Seth will get into a lot more detail of what those species and everything look like. But you can kind of think of it as grasslands that were prevalent with a lot of forbs and flowering plants that really help support pollinators and created an ecosystem that was really rich in biodiversity, a lot of different animal and plant life, and really kind of, added a lot of beauty to the region, I guess you could say too. What this means for Eastern too, from the educational standpoint, is we're always trying to find those new opportunities, find ways to train students into jobs into fields that they want to go get jobs in, and looking what those options are. This Prairie restoration project really expands to educational opportunities that are beyond just what you'd expect. I've mentioned the biology department so far, but really this project has been really interdisciplinary. We've been trying to find ways to get students to connect across programming. So for instance, the biology department worked with the education department on an EPA grant a few years back, where the goal of it was to drive educational opportunities in conservation and restoration and why those things are important. And so biology students worked with educational students to teach in Cheney schools, to lead discussions with, it was the Cheney, can't remember their term for it, but basically their community center. So connecting with just folks in the community. So, you know, kind of beyond the K through 12 approach, but even just more broader in the community. How do we increase awareness and talk about conservation? We've had students do web design kiosks. We've had students in computer science build database for research management for us. We've had technical communication students interview biology students and biology professors and other folks who've worked on the project, and then they use their technical communication skills to essentially take that dense, heavy scientific information, but then write it in a way that's more easily understandable for the campus community and other folks as we kind of continue to expand our conversations around this project. So it's a lot of great opportunities there for on the educational side, and it also drives a lot of research. And you'll hear a lot about it with Kristy and Seth today on the research they're actually taking on. But really kind of a goal that we can push with this is creating what's called a living laboratory. So when you think about a university, you know, we have a lot of great educational and academic opportunities there, but we also manage facilities. And this is an example where, you know, we're taking on a restoration project, and that's something that facilities could just say, hey, we're just going to go do it. We're going to put in restoration. We'll put our grounds crew on it. We'll just manage it, and that's it. But that's not really the best approach for a university to take on. There's just so much we can learn from it. And if we design this more with the intent that this is a laboratory space that facilities helps to manage, it creates a whole lot of new opportunities to drive really fun, cool new academic opportunities for our students and our faculty to do research, pull together presentations, create publications, and really learn more of kind of those technical skills that they would be taking from the university setting into their professional careers as they move on. And lastly, too, we want to help create education or recreational opportunities and really help get people out there. And so we'll be putting in a multi-use trail system. We're working with our cross-country running team to design the trail system to lay out. So it will have loops on it, like a 1K, 2K, 3K loops that they can structure together in different ways so they can use it for their training practices. So we get people out there running, using the land. In the wintertime, we can go cross-country skiing when we get enough snow. And we've also working with Epic, which is kind of our outdoor school. It's not like academic outdoor school, but it's the group that that takes students out and teaches backpacking, climbing, mountain biking, leadership skills, things like that. So they can kind of teach their introductory classes just right there on campus now. And, you know, students can load up a backpack for the first time and go hike around for a couple hours and see what that, you know, that weight feels like before they actually go out backpacking. And so we're really happy about this and excited about this to create these recreational opportunities, because a big part of what we're doing here too is trying to help create a sense of place. Because if you really understand your place and where you're at, you tend to develop better connections to your environment and to your community. And so providing recreational space is actually a great way to help create that sense of place for a lot of people who might not otherwise as easily connect with their natural and community surroundings. So here's kind of a master plan overview of it. Might be a little small on here. You can go to, if you Google search EWU, Palouse, or Prairie Restoration Project EWU, any combination of those in a Google search, you'll be able to pull up our website, which will have this map and other information in much more detail so you can expand it and look out. So just kind of a quick overview that we would be laying it out, as I mentioned, with trail system, spaces designated for laboratory space, kiosks that would talk about some of the natural and cultural history of the area, and just a lot of great ways to hopefully engage people with an ecosystem, with this endangered ecosystem and what it means for the region. One thing that we're really excited about here is you can kind of see on the left-hand side, we've started a experimental site. So last fall in October, we worked with a native plant restoration company called BFI out of Moses Lake. And they help us put in an experimental site that is going to be testing different ratios, essentially, of native grasses to forb species to kind of further the conversation about how you do restoration. There's a lot of people already doing this work, doing absolutely excellent work in restoration, but there are a lot of questions that haven't been answered yet. And one of those questions is, how do you get forbs to successfully establish? A lot of the CRP, or conservation reverse programming that's been happening for decades now, while it's been really beneficial from the CRP program, which is a federal program that essentially pays farmers to take their land out of production to help protect the soils and to kind of give farmers different alternatives to just constantly tilling their land and farming. Through all of that history, we've learned a lot about how to establish grasses, but it's when you establish grasses and forbs together is where we see challenges. And so that's some of the research we're taking on now, and to try and kind of figure out what that means, and how that process goes. So we studied in early fall. I was just out walking the site yesterday, starting to see a little bit of germination, but I think really in the next few months, we'll hopefully be seeing a lot of these plants start to come up. And then over the years, really watch to see this start to develop. And so I'll just say now too, just an open invitation to anybody on this. Shoot me an email if you want to come out and see our site in person and want to tour and kind of learn more about it. And as time goes on, more things will be growing. Right now, it just looks like a barren dirt field, but hopefully it looks a lot closer here in the months to come. So a quick list of the species that we're planting. When we look at our high diversity treatment, it's kind of a mix of, like I mentioned, grasses. So basin wild rye, Idaho fescue, blue bunch wheatgrass, peregrine June grass, bluegrasses, things like that. But then also moving into the forbs, some of the ones that are common that people see, like yarrow and balsam root, blanket flower, but then moving into some other plants too that aren't as common, or at least in other areas. And we're trying to figure out how to really bring these all back. And so we've been working with, there are some great native seed growers in our region, BFI being one of those who helped plant the site, but also Thorn Creek Nursery down by Moscow has been doing a lot of great work too, and helping to bring back a lot of these plant species and try to make these plant species more commonly available for people to take on their own restoration projects. And so if folks are looking for places to potentially get seeds on, those are two that we've worked with, and that these specific seed lists came from both BFI and Thorn Creek Nursery. So just to give you a sense of where our seeds are coming from. And so with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Seth and Kristy to kind of work through the research they're doing and kind of how that all comes together. So Seth, take it over.
Well, thank you, Erik. And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I guess before I start, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so Kristy and I are going to be talking about some of our research and then some of the other work that's been going on in relation to this project. And I'll start with just what I've been focusing on, which is mainly the soil and the microbes within the soil. And then Kristy will go on to talk about the plant communities in these sites. And just a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm just going to mention why researching soils are important, some of the impacts that agriculture has had on soils in the Palouse, some strategies that we have on remediating the soils, and then going into my research where I was interested in looking at the impacts of biochar amendments on soil abiotic and biotic conditions. Next slide. Cool. So why is researching soils important? Well, soils provide essential nutrients, water, oxygen, and support to roots, which are all essential for a healthy plant community. Also, soils and their microbiomes provide vital ecosystem services and functions, such as nutrient cycling and carbon sequestration. And grasslands and prairies are known for being reliable sinks of carbon. And so restoring these systems are very important, especially in the face of climate change. Many studies have shown that plant diversity is closely related with microbial diversity, and that specific habitats will have their own specific microbiomes found within those soils. And a lot is still not known about soils and their microbes and how these microbes interact with one another and how the microbes are interacting with the plants. And the more that we know about these interactions, the more that we'll be able to answer questions about the soil, and the better we'll be at to suggesting strategies on remediating these degraded soils. Next slide. Yeah, so how has agriculture impacted soils here in the Palouse? Well, first, what kind of soils do we have here in the Palouse? The Palouse consists of rolling hills of loess soil, which is made up of fine-grained silts, clays, and sands that were transported by wind after the Pleistocene glacial events and the megafloods. Loess soil is deep and fertile, and it's rich in organic matter, which makes it very attractive for agricultural purposes. And some of the impacts that agriculture has had on soil is just long-term tilling can break up the soil and loosen up the soil, creating or causing more soil erosion. Also, the use of ammonia-based fertilizers can release nitrates into the soil, which then can increase the concentration of free hydrogen ions, which causes the soil to become more acidic. And many researchers throughout and farmers throughout the Palouse have recorded pHs at 5 or below 5, which is pretty acidic for soils. And there's also been records of a reduction in more than half of the organic matter in these soils. And a lot of that has to do with, so our native plants, especially bunch grasses, they have really deep roots. In the picture on the bottom, you can kind of see just a comparison of the root systems of wheat compared to bunch grass systems, and just how deep those roots really are in our native systems. And you're losing out on a lot of that carbon sequestration in the soil. Next slide. So what are some of the strategies that practitioners have for remediating soils? Well, there's several strategies. Some projects have used soil inoculation, by which they take soils from healthy sites and then mix it into soils that have been degraded in order to help introduce the microbes that are found at our healthy sites into soils that are degraded and don't have those the microbial diversity of our healthy systems. Really, that strategy might not be the best for the Palouse, however, because it does require the use of a lot of soil. And since there is not that much remnant prairies left, it might be doing more harm than good. But there's also other strategies such as soil amendments, like manure, biochar, and lime, which all help incorporate organic matter into the soil and help buffer pH of the soil. And other strategies are such as revegetation are used as well. And Eastern specifically is using revegetation and also testing biochar soil amendments to see how that impacts remediating the soil at our sites. Next slide. So you may know, but what is biochar? Biochar is a charcoal-based product made by burning organic material in the absence or in low levels of oxygen. And this organic material can be either wheat straw, wood chips, manure, or any other organic material that you have. Biochar is used as a great tool for carbon sequestration because it retains more carbon than it actually releases. So adding it into your soil kind of traps that carbon into your soil for a long time. And having it in the soil, biochar is extremely porous. So it helps absorb water and holds onto that water. So it increases soil moisture holding capacity of the soil, especially in the area where the root systems are. Biochar also has a slightly negative charge, which allows it to attract positively charged ions within the soil, such as calcium, potassium, and magnesium, which are all essential nutrients for plants. So that can be very beneficial. Also, biochar is slightly basic. So adding it to acidic soils helps buffer the soil, just adding it to the soil. Next slide. So yeah, now I'm going to talk about some of my research where I was interested in looking at how those biochar soil amendments were impacting the soil abiotically and the biotic conditions. And some of my goals of my research were to compare soil abiotic conditions and nematode abundance between Palouse Prairie remnants and Eastern's Prairie restoration site, and while also investigating how those biochar amendments were impacting the soil abiotic conditions and nematode abundance at Eastern site. Next slide. So for my research, I sampled 3 prairie remnant sites, Medical Lake, Kamiak Butte, and Steptoe Butte. And also I sampled Eastern's pilot site, the 15-acre pilot site. Next slide. So for each site, I collected 12 soil cores per site. And at Eastern site, I took 12 cores per biochar treatment. And I did that monthly between the months of March and July. And then I took the soil back into the lab and I extracted nematodes and counted them to determine nematode abundance. And then I also determined soil moisture, pH, and organic matter for each sample at all of our sites. Next slide. And just as some of my results that I've gotten, I found that prairie remnants had significantly higher nematode abundance, soil organic matter, and had higher soil pH compared to Eastern's pilot site. And I found that biochar amendments were able to increase the soil pH at Eastern's restoration site closer to levels that were found at remnant sites, which were around neutral. It was like 6.8, pretty close to neutral. And within the first year of amending the soil with biochar, the high biochar treatments have increased beneficial soil nematode abundance by 79.2% at Eastern's pilot site. I also found that there were strong relationships between soil organic matter and soil moisture, as well as relationships between nematode abundance and soil pH. And those relationships were strong at all of my sites. Even though my results seem pretty good, I do suggest that there's more long-term research done before there's any large amounts of biochar added to the soil at Eastern site. But from my research, I found that biochar seems to be very beneficial to the soil, but there's much more to learn. And now you'll hear from Kristy and more about her research.
Thank you, Seth. And can you guys all hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I'm Kristy Snyder. I'm in Dr. Rebecca Brown's lab here at Eastern, and my research is really focusing on the functional role of annual seed addition and biochar addition in prairie restoration. Next slide. So the framework for my research really revolves around manipulating grassland succession. So grassland succession is really similar to forest succession. You start out with the pioneering stage, usually after a disturbance, where there's bare ground and rock, not really any plants. And that's kind of where the Eastern site was before we recently just seeded it. So the disturbance being agriculture in this sense. We then went to our first herb stage, which is where you have your annual forbs coming in, your invasive annual grasses, relatively poor soil conditions. And then you finally get to a climax community where you have these deep-rooted perennial bunch grasses like the ones Seth showed prior. And also you have this soil that's really healthy and rich in organic matter. And so the main goals of restoration are to get to that healthy climax community. And in doing so, we normally just, plant and seed perennial bunch grasses or large perennials like balsam root. But in doing so, we neglect this first herb stage and the diversity of species that we could potentially use to reduce annual invasive grasses or other weedy species. So I'm actually looking at how annual forbs are going to be impacting our restoration. Next slide. And so a lot of the reason we think that nobody really uses annual species in their restoration is because they don't know which species to use. And because there's not really a demand for these species, there's not really much available to use. So in the past couple of years, we've only had Clarkia pulchella and Colomia grandiflora available from commercial seed producers. So a main goal of my research is to see if we can maybe get different species or find evidence to get these different species available from commercial producers. Next slide. And so I did an annual native seed addition experiment, a biochar soil addition experiment, and a soil seed bank characterization. And so we are hoping with the annual native seed addition and biochar addition to evaluate if adding either one improves our restoration outcomes by increasing native plant cover and native plant richness, or the number of species. And for the soil seed bank, our goal was to really compare the species that there is at local remnants and get a baseline for the Eastern Restoration Site prior to our seeding. Next slide. And so this is actually at our research plots. This was seeded last January. And so we did a factorial design and we blocked everything by topography, since we have a lot of rolling hills in the Palouse. So first we added annual native species, which will be those dots. We also added biochar, which is the cross hatching, and then a perennial seed mix. So one of the seed mixes Erik had talked about earlier. So we used a low diversity and a high diversity mix, and the high being the darker colors and the low being the lighter colors. And we used bottom of the hill, top of the hill, because the way the water flows, bottoms of the hills tend to be a little bit more moist. Tops of the hills tend to be really dry. And then we used north, south, east, west. Next slide. And so these are the annual species we used in our seed mix. So we have Collinsia linearis, the Colomia grandiflora, the Epilobium brachycarpum, 2 different species of Mattia, the Polygonum majus, and Plantago patagonica. And so all of these species are or were locally collected in September of 2020, and we hand cleaned them. We did germination tests prior to seeding them, and they were seeded all by hand. So we just spread them out into our experimental plots themselves. Next slide. And this is actually us spreading biochar. So that's Seth on the left picture there. And we did this by using the same concentration. We used, I think, 600 pounds per acre. And we added them to the experimental plots, which what you see on the right there. And next slide. And so these are my results for native species cover and how it affected our overall vegetation at the site. So on the y-axis there, you have the native species cover, and on the bottom, you have our treatments. So those different squares. So the annual species and our annual seed addition and biochar, and then biochar only, annual only, and neither. We also have it separated by the left half is the high diversity perennial seed mix, and the right was the low diversity. So the difference being an additional 7 species in the high diversity mix. And we really found that only biochar and annual seed addition was really important for bottom of the hill slopes. But having a lower diversity mix with annuals and biochar significantly increased our overall native plant cover. Next slide. And as for richness, we actually found that adding annual species in general, only in the low diversity mix, increased our species richness, which we're kind of confused about. It seems kind of counterintuitive. If you add more species, you should have more species, but this could be due to proportions of seeds in their seed mixes. So it's mainly the yarrow that really kind of exploded for the low diversity perennial seed mix. And it also for our native species richness, all of our annual seeds, one of each species did germinate, but only in our low diversity bottoms. So that's mainly where you're seeing the large jump there. Next slide. And so then we did compare our different topographic variations to see where the annual species were mainly concentrating. And in that bottom left corner, that's where most of the annual species are. So they really only germinated in the bottom of the hills. And that could just be due to it being a drought year last year. maybe there wasn't enough moisture everywhere else for pretty much anything but weeds to germinate.
Hmm.
And then next slide. So the key findings from that part of my experiment was that annual seeds should be added in the low diversity mixes in our swales. And the two most successful species were the Plantago patagonica and both the Mattias, which is really cool because some of the Mattias actually have allelopathic properties. And so they could be a source for more research. Also for biochar, it really only was significant in increasing native plant cover in our southwest slopes. So maybe we should just be selectively adding it to those slopes only. The next slide. For my soil seed bank methods, I went to the same 4 sites as Seth, and we collected our soil cores. So we were with the goal of finding different species that we could potentially use for our seeding. So we collected soil cores, we came back to the greenhouse, spread them over flats, and we grew them out over the summer, and we actually just moved them out of cold strat this week. So they're out of, they were in fridges for their winter, for their cold dormancy, and now they're back in the greenhouse growing again, and we've just been identifying them as they germinate. So any species that are stored in the seed bank should be getting identified. Next. And this part is still an ongoing part of my research. We did compare the above ground species to the seed bank species. And the above ground, we have about 94 species at the 4 different sites, with 3 of them being remnants. And for our seed bank, so far there's only 11 species, and most of them are non-native weeds, such as St. John's wort. So hopefully we'll get some more results in the upcoming weeks. But with this, this portion of the experiment, it should be informing what we should be focusing our seed collection efforts on for the greenhouse. Next slide. So Seth and I have actually this past summer been collecting seeds as part of an ongoing project at Eastern. So we've been collecting locally sourced seeds for the use in this project. We've been going out and hand collecting them and then cleaning them in the greenhouse. And we're still working on getting them stored, but we're hoping to have them stored in the fridge for up to 5 years. And this might be another way we can add diversity to our research site, or maybe we can start growing plants for adding like pollinator islands out at our restoration site. Next slide. We also are doing a little bit more research on different germination protocols and propagation methods for a lot of these species. There's not a lot of research on some of them on how to grow them, or if there's a special treatment they need, like the cold dormancy or gibberellic acid or things like that. So Seth and I have been also doing research, doing different germination methods, propagating from cuttings and getting different cutting methods. And then we've also been propagating them for use in our seed increase garden. And I'm actually going to hand it back over to Seth for talk about the seed increase garden.
Yeah, so part of the project, or I guess something that Kristy mentioned, is that some seeds are either not available by commercial seed producers, or they're just only available in like very low numbers. So something that we have developed at Eastern is a seed increase garden to hopefully increase the amount of native seeds and native annual seeds that we have on site. So we have gone out, collected seeds, and then brought them back and propagated them in our greenhouse. These are some of the pictures of the plants that we propagated last summer. And then if you want to go to next slide. So once we propagated them, we overwintered most of the plants that weren't large enough to go in the ground over the last summer. And then over the last, over fall, we also had a seeding event to where we had a bunch of students come up to the greenhouse. They seeded flats, and then we put them outside in mulch in order to overwinter them. And now just this past week, we're actually starting to bring in some of those flats. There's a bunch of germinations happening, and we're going to be transplanting, and a bunch of work is going on up in the greenhouse now. Next slide. So once we have our propagated seeds and our seedlings, and they're to a size that are good enough to go into the ground, we have rows outside of our greenhouse that we can place these plants in the ground. And then throughout the summer, we collect those seeds just as a way to bulk our seed collection. And then we are also working on ways to help store those seeds longer. And we've kind of developed this seed drying chamber on your right. And yeah, if you want to go to the next slide. That's basically it. If anybody has questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay. Erik, maybe if you stop sharing your screen now, we can see you guys on screen. Hi, Seth, Erik, Kristy. I'm sure we have some questions in the chat, and probably some questions here in the room. Let's see, what do we have in the chat? Let's start with that. Okay, this is kind of a imagination question. What did the Palouse look like before agriculture?
That's a great question. I'll let Kristy probably answer most of that, because that really gets into the biology side of things, and that's something we're trying to figure out. But Kristy's got a pretty good handle on that, I think. So
Yeah, I mean, we're assuming that some of it was like our remnants that are left, but we don't actually know 100%. I mean, there's a lot of research on like the Ice Age floods, but there's like a big gap in between with more recent research. So I would think probably closer to what our remnants look like bunch grasses. Lots of bunch grasses is what the historical range used to be, but there's not a lot about the forb diversity.
A related question to that, Kristy, is how did the Native Americans manage the Palouse prairies?
Yeah, I think they have a more holistic approach in managing the land than we do. I honestly don't know a lot about the research in that field, but I do think that it's more hands-off than what we are currently doing, because now we use herbicides or other things that I don't think would be commonly used then.
one thing I think I forgot to mention in the introduction is we do sit on the tribal homelands of the Spokane tribe, or the traditional homelands of the Spokane tribe, and we have been working with them to get a better understanding of what the Palouse looked like, how it was used, starting to understand more of the plants from a cultural historical context rather than just the straight natural context. And through that, Dr. Melody Wynn with Spokane Tribe is doing this awesome project called their Food Sovereignty Project, where they've got some land up by Welpinit, and they're looking to grow out a lot of native species that were food staples for the Spokane Tribe. And so they're doing a lot of research on how do we restore these plants, how do we do it in a way that's effective for harvesting, and how can they do it to help and how they can help support their communities through bringing back these traditional food sources. And so we've been working with them to grow plants. Seth mentioned we had a planting date this last fall. Dr. Wynn came out for that, as well as some other folks from the Spokane tribe that help with that. So we've been growing plants with them in our greenhouse, and then we've been providing them to them where they can transplant it to their site. And then they've been sharing a lot of great information with us as well. So from that standpoint, we're kind of really working on that still and trying to get a good sense on that. And the Spokane tribe has actually been just a great host, wealth of information on that. And I can connect anybody to Dr. Melody Wynn if they'd like to learn more about those things as well.
Thank you. Any questions here from the audience here in the library?
What about the wildfires, native fires? I mean, natural fires? Was that a part of the Palouse historically?
So to the extent that fires came through the region, I don't have as great of a hold on kind of what that looked like. But I will say it kind of opens up a general question for us is what does kind of long-term management look like when we talk about replicating natural systems that we don't have the ability to go back and look at? This has been kind of a question is like, well, if you look more at like kind of like how certain species of animals would have moved through in terms of did we have, would there have been a lot of grazing animals that would have came through and eaten down some of the plants, and does that help with their propagation and helping to kind of push out noxious plants and give, was that part of the system of plant management? And then the other question is, yeah, was fire a big component of that and helping to kind of keep these plant systems in check? And so that's kind of an ongoing question we've had too, is like, what does this really look like? How do we replicate having a herd of animals move through our Palouse restoration project? We're never gonna be able to set it on fire. I can guarantee that. So we can't test that one. So one of the ideas is, can you do mowing to help replicate that process? And that's kind of a weed management tool that we'll probably be using, because when you plant forbs and grasses together, it means that we can no longer use broadleaf herbicides to spray out a lot of those noxious weeds, because then you'd also kill off your forbs. And so it kind of brings in mowing is kind of an effective weed management tool. And that starts to kind of maybe replicate some of those past natural kind of management systems, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I've got one. Two kind of related questions. I have a friend or two up in the Idaho Panhandle who have worked on some grassland or the sort of grassland restorations on their small acreages. And one problem that I've heard that they've run into is that the grasses in these young plantings tend to overtake the forbs. Is that something that you've experienced, and how might they think about dealing with that? And then I have a second question.
Did you hear that, Erik?
Yeah. So basically, how do you get forbs to establish with grasses?
Yeah.
I think Kristy's got some thoughts on this. I will mention really quick that that's kind of like our experimental site. That's one of the research things we're taking on. We've been working with folks at Department of Fish and Wildlife. Dr. Kurt Merg with Fish and Wildlife, he's done a lot of work within conservation reserve programming and putting a lot of in Palouse kind of systems down around the Pullman area. And that's something that he's always kind of struggled with too, is how do you get the grasses to not outcompete those forbs? And so there's a lot of different techniques, but I'll let Kristy kind of dive into that, because that's a little bit more on her research side of things. So
Yeah, you could do like staged planting. So you could, get some forbs to establish first and then bring some grasses in later. You could also try doing a mixture of like plugs versus seed to see maybe like buy some more time for the perennials to establish that aren't grasses, the forbs. But yeah, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done on that. That's something that I think all of our research projects on the Palouse Prairie project right now have kind of we all are wondering, including like we have a person working on pollinator networks and she has the same questions. So yeah, hopefully we'll answer some of that with our seed experiment.
Very good. And then my second question is related to the native plants for the Idaho Panhandle versus the Palouse. Are your seed sources good sources for us up here if we were wanting to consider a planting up in the Idaho Panhandle?
Kristy, I'll let you take that one.
I would probably say no. A rule of thumb is try to get seeds within like 20 miles of your project, so they're locally sourced and locally adapted. For example, like a lot of our research that's in the South Palouse, which is kind of like the Pullman area, those seeds are adapted to having a lot more moisture than our seeds up here. We're in more of a arid region, so we can't actually use a lot of the species that are grown down there. We could use it if it's an ecotype that was from up here that's grown down there and then back up here. But yeah, I would say locally sourced is much better.
There is I guess a trade-off to that though too, is when we were going through with sourcing seeds for our experimental plot, the seeds that we want to grow, we can go out there and do some seed collection, which Kristy and Seth did last summer, and we had a student, Sarah Hill, who did it the summer previously. So we've been doing a lot of seed collecting to create our own seed increase garden to be able to provide those seeds that we need for ourselves. But for the experimental site, we were working with BFI, as I mentioned, and also Thorn Creek Nursery. So BFI is in Moses Lake, Thorn Creek Nursery is down near Pullman, Moscow area. And so we can try really hard to source as locally as we can, but there are limitations to what's commercially available right now. So try and get as local as you can, but then there's also kind of just the realities of what may or may not be available to you as well.
Other questions here from the audience or on chat? Oh, here's one. Yeah. Does your project have promise for securing our native bee species?
That's the hope. You know, the Forbes network is a really bunch of flowering plants that will really help support those bee populations. And we do have a grad student, Emma Hoskins, who she's just finishing her master's. And so her master's research was on pollinator networks and trying to get a better understanding of how our native bees and other native pollinators kind of respond to different plant networks and kind of like what's an important species to consider in restoration. Kristy, I think you're a little bit more familiar with Emma's research too, if you want to add anything onto that.
Yeah, she actually found a lot of really interesting results. Like a lot of non-native species are really important for pollinator networks because they flower later in the season. So maybe having a wider array of forbs where you have flowering times all the way through like October would be beneficial for helping our native bee species. I will say that in her research and at other research from another former student, Erik Peterson, they all found that Epilobium brachycarpum, which is the annual willow herb, is really important for our pollinator networks, and at like pretty much every remnant has that species. So luckily we're using it at our site. So hopefully we'll have some more research on that.
I have one more question.
Julie.
Is there any potential for these plots to be studied as possibly biofuels, or is that just a totally different area of study?
Yeah, that's actually my background is biofuels. I don't know if we would look at native species as potential feedstocks for producing biofuels. Kind of where the biofuels, if we're talking about in general production of biofuels, you need a lot of feedstock material. And so I would worry that in securing those native plants for that feedstock material, it'd be kind of devastating to those populations as we try to restore them. There's also challenges with going with different types of essentially feedstocks when you're producing biofuels. What you really want is a material that's really rich in cellulose, because cellulose is essentially just a whole bunch of glucose molecules strung together. And so that glucose is basically sugar. But if you can get to that and isolate that, you have the ability to produce fuels off of that easier than going other routes. And so but then there's also challenges with other essentially molecules, chemicals that are in plants that can inhibit the biofuel production process. I mean, there's a lot of ways to produce biofuels, but in particular, when you look at grasses, they're more rich in silica and like silicates, and those are detrimental to the the conversion process of plant material into fuel. So I think there's a couple issues that would hold up using native plants for the production of biofuels. And I think you'd be more looking at using agricultural residues, like wheat straw is one that I know folks have done some work on. My background in particular is working with poplar trees, and especially because poplar trees you can use for wastewater remediation with wastewater treatment plants. If you go to near Hayden, can't remember exactly where near Hayden, but there's a wastewater treatment facility that is doing exactly that. I was working with them, and they're growing out poplar trees and using those poplar trees to help clean up their the effluent essentially coming out of the wastewater treatment facility, and then looking if we could use those trees to then convert them to producing different types of biofuels or biochemicals. So I can talk way too long about that, but it's a rough idea.
There was a question in the chat here that maybe folks in the audience didn't see, is what is the source of your biochar? And Erik answered, biochar came from wheat straw produced by Ag Energy.
Yeah. So Ag Energy is a company local to Cheney. They're kind of a startup company that's trying to figure out how to produce biochar on commercial scale. They've been pretty successful, it sounds like, so far. The biochar essentially market it's hot. I mean, they're selling their biochar for something like $16,000 a ton when they got for the right people. So just to put that in perspective, the trade-off is that means that like a cubic foot bag is going for like 20 bucks. Biochar is really light, so it's not like there's a lot of density there when we're talking about a per tonnage. So maybe it's easier to think about on a per volume perspective. But they're working on how you can target biochar for different growing applications, because through the biochar conversion process and the plant material they use, it can yield different benefits that they can tailor to specific crops. And so that's some of the work they're doing. And we were able to connect with them to see if they'd be interested in learning about the potential use of using biochar in native plant restoration, which they were. So we have a research agreement with them in which they supplied us with about 17 cubic yards of biochar that we are applying, or have applied, and that's what a lot of Seth's research dove into. So.
Yeah, and I don't want to leave Seth out of the questioning here, but nematodes Seth, in your nematode counting, there are nematodes that feed on plant roots, and there are predatory nematodes that feed on other nematodes. So they're the bad and the good of the nematodes. Did you kind of separate that out at all?
Yeah. So yeah, whenever I was looking at the nematodes, I also looked at functional groups within the nematodes. So I was looking at bacterial feeders, fungal feeders, plant parasites, omnivores, and just predatory nematodes. So yeah, plant predators can be looked at as like not beneficial to plants, but bacteriivores and fungivores and omnivores, they can be beneficial because bacteria immobilizes a lot of nutrients within the soil, and once nematodes eat them, they can basically convert those nutrients back into inorganic forms, which then can be used by plants. So yeah, I did separate them out, and the 79% increase was like the beneficial nematodes.
Great, good, thank you. Might also add that picture of the that you had of the bunch grass roots and the wheat roots. That actually looked like a graduate student of mine from years ago, Jerry Glover. And he was at the Land Institute. And if anybody knows about the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, they are breeding perennial wheats for food production, so that they get the root system and they produce the grain for wheat. And they were still working on the the culinary aspects are still the challenge, I think, with those perennial wheats. Anyway, that's just it looked like Jerry. Any other questions? Yes.
I have one, but I don't know if it's really related to this. I have a friend that lives over by the Seattle area, and where their sewage treatment plant is, they sell, you can go in and buy bags of affluent waste for your gardens. Mm-hmm. Is there anything on the east side is there anything over here? Is it that happening over here?
Yeah, actually the Cheney wastewater treatment facility does exactly that. So basically they've set up their process. There's different designs for wastewater treatment facilities, but the way Cheney runs theirs is wastewater comes in and it goes through the anaerobic and aerobic digestion processes. But it's driven by a bunch of basically microorganisms that really help break down the waste that is in wastewater. And so those bacteria and other organisms feed on whatever is in the wastewater stream. They get happy, they replicate over and over and over, and then they die. And when they die, you're left with their cellular mass. So this isn't necessarily like they've already cleaned up everything, but you're just left with their cellular mass. And they pull that cellular mass out and then mix it with compost, like just yard waste compost, essentially. And it produces a really rich compost, essentially a even richer compost that they, I think, sell or maybe just give away. I can't remember. It's really reasonably priced. It's Class A biosolids, essentially. Biosolids is the term that they use for those, but it is perfectly clean. You can put it on your gardens, grow food with it, or just apply it to fields for growing out crops or whatever you need, but it's really rich. We use it in our campus garden. They've given us some truckloads of it before, and we use it as a kind of a soil amendment as well. So yeah, City of Cheney wastewater treatment facility. There's probably others, but I know them for sure. So.
You know if it's happening over in Idaho at all? Or just Washington?
I don't know that as well. I just a little bit of experience working up in, it was Rathdrum was where the wastewater treatment facilities we're working with that was growing some poplar trees. But that's kind of starts to get a little bit further outside of the things I've been working on. So.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Erik, big picture, what's the the future of the project? What's the timeline?
Yeah.
How do you see it going over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just, the rough background, Eastern is a state university, so we get our funds from the legislature. So this is a project that isn't something that we can necessarily fund directly from our kind of our state allotted funds. And so this is a project that we're driving entirely through grants and donations. And so we've been able to fund the experimental site and get that going. And now we're in the fundraising stage for the next round, which would be essentially finishing out that 110-ish acres that we have left and doing the restoration on that. So we're raising funds to take that on right now. We're applying to some grants, always looking for donors who want to, be a part of the process with us. And essentially, once those funds come in, it's, the restoration work, it's the timeline to, if you gave me all the money I need right now and said, go for it, what's your timeline on it? It's a little, it's a little challenging to give that because once again, it goes back to that question of seed source availability and how local is local. And so that then means we start having those conversations with our local seed growing partners to develop the genotypes that are locally adapted to our project. And so it becomes a question of how much of that seed's available now versus how much they'd have to grow out. And if they have to grow it out, it's a year or two before they're able to then grow out and then provide the amount of seed that we need. And then once the restoration project starts, pretty much gets seeded in 1 year or in just one planting system with just seed drilling process, very similar to no-till drilling if you were putting in wheat or other similar crops. So that goes in, and then it's just time and trying to manage the weeds so that we give the native plants a chance to outcompete any of the noxious weeds that are sitting in that soil seed bank. So from a restoration standpoint, we look at it as having, from once those seeds are in the ground to once they come out, it's probably about 3 to 5 years of like active management, where we're going to be continually monitoring the noxious plant kind of density and when it looks like they're going to seeds, and do we have to mow the whole site before they go to seed? Can we do spot spraying or hand pulling? And so it's kind of like this intense management over those first few years. And then ideally the system should then start to stabilize and move on. So you're kind of looking at, from start to finish, probably a 4 to 5 year window for what we'd consider like the hands-on management approach before you transition to more kind of like a long-term sustainable management plan.
Great. One last question from me, and maybe the audience members are interested in this. If you were to recommend a site, a location to go see remnant Palouse Prairie in its native state, where that we wouldn't trample completely, where do you recommend in the North Palouse?
Oh, Kristy and Seth have been to, they do a bunch of seed collecting. I'll let them kind of share their favorite spots that at least you have public access to. There are private landowners who have provided us access onto their lands, which wouldn't be an option, but Kristy and Seth can share that of where they've been collecting seeds at.
Well, if you're willing to go down to like the southern Palouse, so closer to Pullman, it's where all like the really pristine remnants are. I don't know. If you want a good hike, Kamiak Butte has some great some great viewpoints. But I really like Steptoe personally. That was my favorite site. That's that pretty like the very pretty sky with all the flower pictures that Seth and I both used. So I think Seth might have also liked that site as well. As far as northern sites, there's not too many that are still intact up here. I think there's a small parcel in Medical Lake, but that's really hard to access. Yeah, we've been mainly collecting like roadside or at Turnbull or other parks as well. I don't know, do you have any in mind, Seth?
Yeah, I would probably just say Kamiak and Steptoe. I mean, I'm pretty limited to the ones that I have been to, but Kamiak is a great one that's like publicly accessible. So
Yeah, I agree with you. I lived in the Moscow Pullman area for almost 30 years, and Kamiak was the go-to spot for just the beauty of the Palouse. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, any final questions from here in Sandpoint or in Zoom land? Oh, there's one in the back here.
Is homemade biochar feasible? I've heard splash every year, and I'm wondering if you have any recommended techniques for maximizing biochar production?
Homemade biochar, is that feasible, and is there ways of doing that?
So yeah, there's kind of, so I'll answer this kind of a couple ways. So the biochar we're using that Ag Energy is producing is they actually have like their own proprietary commercial system they've developed with basically like shipping containers they've built these things into that they can feed the wheat straw or whatever feedstock into and create really high temperatures and pressures in the absence of oxygen to develop out kind of more of this like commercially available biochar. But there are ways to produce biochar yourself on a much smaller scale. Essentially, they look like almost like burn barrels, kind of like almost like these big metal tins that you can use that help kind of restrict the oxygen at kind of that lower level as that charcoal is essentially developing. So you can look into using those things. I know that a couple of the organizations that I work with and know, the Lands Council out of Spokane, they've been doing some biochar burns. And then the Phoenix Conservation out of Pullman area, they've been doing some biochar burns with those as well. The one challenge that we have when we talk about producing biochar is it's illegal in Washington state to produce biochar in those open pits because it's basically a burn barrel. And we have burn barrel restrictions in Washington that do not allow for producing biochar out of those systems. Over in Idaho, though, from what I hear, that's where the Lands Council and also the Phoenix Conservation has been doing their burn bans because in Idaho, you all don't have a restriction on burning in burn barrels. And so you're able to produce biochar with those smaller systems. So you can check those out or reach out to those organizations too if you want to learn a little bit more about the systems that they're running, because what they do is not an option for us to look at from a regulatory standpoint.
And we got one final question here in the chat about using citizen scientists in any of this process.
Yeah, that's a big part of this. You know, we're learning every day what it means to be part of the Palouse, part of the Palouse ecosystem, what that habitat looks like, how can we restore it. And if Eastern just goes ahead and does our restoration on 120 acres and that's all we've done, I mean, that's great, that's a contribution to it. But I don't think the conversation stops there. It's really more about what do we want to do as a community and as a region, how do we want to value our natural areas and how can we do our own restoration? So from the citizen science part, you have opportunities, especially working with the Native Plant Society, to look at where you can do your own restoration work, regardless if it's Palouse or not. The ability to engage in those things, I think, is really beneficial. Big part of that being as we move forward with climate change and looking at, there is the impact of climate change that is inevitable. Even if we stopped all emissions today, we still have that inherent climate change forcings that we're going to feel and already do. And so it's those native plant species that are probably going to help us adapt and change to these changing climates and be a little bit more resilient than things that are non-native species. That's all going to change and evolve over time. And so involvement from the community and understanding kind of those trade-offs tracking those things, being a part of those conversations, advocating for it. Those are all things where the community kind of at large can really start to come together and support these things and show that there's interest and support there. Commercial seed producers that we work with, they do it, one, because it's, you know, it's their job, but also because they love doing restoration work, and they would love to see more people take on restoration work, because that's when we talk about seed availability, the more restoration work that happens, the more seeds that are going to be available. So we're constrained a little bit right now by what's available, but if there was more demand, it would start to drive market changes in that as well. So there's a lot of opportunities there just in general. If folks are interested in learning more about what they could do connected with Eastern, please reach out to me and I can get you in touch with our faculty or touch more on projects in which you could get associated with. One thing I mentioned too is just Google search EW Palouse, probably the quickest way to pull up our website. Our marketing team at Eastern has made just an incredible website that really lays out our project and details it, and I think in a way that's really visually engaging. So I encourage you all to go check that out if you want to see more pictures and learn about more of the research we're doing. There's some video stories on there and other things that can really kind of tell more of the story than I can, or that we can in just an hour plus presentation. So thanks.
Great. Thank you. And you know, the Palouse all the way from Cheney to Walla Walla is an amazing place. Really amazing place. So
Yeah.
thank you very much, Erik, Kristy, and Seth, and everybody on Zoom and everyone here.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it. And like I said, shoot me an email if you want to come out and just visit campus. I can give you a tour and we can talk more.
Great. Thank you and have a good day, all of you.
Thank you. It was
Thank
great
you.
speaking
Thank
with you all.
you.
See y'all.
Bye.